Trying to get this thing going here. There we go. We will be wrapping up on Colossians next week. This series has gone fairly quickly. I know it's only 4 chapters, and we have taken some of it paragraph by paragraph. And so if any of you have suggestions on a topic or a book, please provide that information to me. Otherwise, I will make a determination and go from there. But I'm interested in your input if there is something, whether of a topical nature or whether a book of the Bible that you would like to try to study together. That would be great. So we are in Colossians chapter 4, 1 through 6. Colossians 4, 1 through 6. Permit me to read the passage. Masters, grant to your slaves justice and fairness, knowing that you too have a master in heaven. Devote yourselves to prayer, keeping alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving, praying at the same time for us as well, that God will open up to us a door for the word, so that we may speak forth the mystery of Christ, for which I have also been imprisoned, that I may make it clear in the way I ought to speak. Conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. Well, we have our final instructions on relationships, in particular with the master and the slaves. And again, you will find a little bit more amplified information in Ephesians chapter 6. And I offered a suggestion on why Ephesians 6 might be more expansive than we have here in Colossians. And that's Ephesians 5, not 6. So we have the final instruction here to masters. Now, he's talking about the relationship between a master and a slave. So one of the questions that came to my mind is how someone became a slave. In biblical times, how did someone become a slave? And is there a difference between a slave and a bond servant? So let's take a moment and consider this. There were 2 ways that a person became a slave. First of all, it was indentured for a debt he could not pay. He had taken out a loan and agreed to the terms. And like the parables taught us in Jesus' ministry, he was thrown into debtor's prison if he could not pay the loan back. Another way a person became a slave was that they were a captive from some type of war. So they were involved in a military campaign, and they lost, and they were taken captive and taken down by their captors to become slaves. Now, there is a third type of slave, but it is known as a bond servant. A bond servant. Paul often, when addressing his letters, identifies himself as a bond servant of the Lord Jesus Christ. A bondservant was a slave who worked for a master, and the master had a gracious, compassionate side to him. And oftentimes he paid the slave wages, not a lot, but gave the slave wages. And that slave would save up his redemption money to pay the master for his freedom. Now, the bond aspect comes from this, that the slave was so loyal and enamored with the master that even though he purchased his freedom, he remained a slave out of love and out of loyalty. That's a bond servant. I don't believe we are talking about bond servants here in chapter 4, verse 1. We are talking about a master who has slaves who are working for him. Now, what was the prevalent attitude towards slaves in Bible times and even through American history and world history? The prevalent attitude towards slaves were that they were a commodity. They were a possession. They could be treated any way the master thought he should treat them or felt like he wanted to treat them. You think of the story of Onesimus and Philemon and Paul's letter to Philemon, and Philemon heeded the counsel in Paul's epistle, and instead of disciplining Onesimus, which could have ranged from a number of different things, he instead, as Paul said, received him back as a brother in the Lord, not only as a slave. So the attitude was, this is my possession. If I want to beat my possession, if I want to starve my possession, if they stole something from me and I want to chop off their hand, that was the prevalent attitude. Now this prevailed all the way through December 6th, 1865, where the Proclamation of Emancipation was signed and enacted as a law freeing the slaves. Now, in doing a little research here, it was almost 2 years later that when the Union troops went down to Texas, that the slaves in Texas realized that they had been freed. The war had been ended for over 2 years. Texas was not a friendly state towards the Republic. They were dyed-in-the-wool Southerners and held to their beliefs very strongly. But this was the prevalent attitude all the way up to 1865. Now, the biblical attitude that Paul is writing about here is found in verse 1. Masters, grant to your slaves. In other words, give them this. Give them this whether you think they deserve it or not, whether you think they have earned it or not. Give to your slaves justice and fairness. Give to your slaves the right thing to be done in their situation and equality. That's what the word fairness means here in the Greek. Equality. Because they are made in the image of God. So they have the same status, if you please, as the master. This is very similar to James, where the poor person has the same status as the rich person. And he tells us why, the motivation to do this. It says in verse 1, knowing that you too, you masters, have a master in heaven. So there is a day of reckoning and accountability for the master's relationship to his slaves and how he treated them. Did he treat them in equality? Did he treat them with right procedures and attitudes? He has a master that he will be accountable to. And so this is a great motivation to consider how I should deal with employer-employee relationships knowing that as a believer, I am going to have to give an accountability for how I have treated those that God has put under my charge as an employer. And so this one single verse has several nuggets of information, several foundational truths that can help improve relationships in the marketplace. Now, if we skip down to verse 2, down to verse 4, Paul talks about prayer. He says, devote yourselves to prayer. The concept of devote in the Greek here means to consistently showing strength which prevails in spite of difficulties, to endure, remain firm, staying in a fixed direction. That's the idea behind devote or devotion. It's a very strong word. It's a very compelling word. It is more powerful than loyal. It is more powerful than affinity for. This is a complete dedication of a person to another person or principles. And it speaks of, as it says there in the definition, consistently showing strength. And how does it show strength? By prevailing in difficult situations, by enduring or remaining firm and staying in a fixed direction. Paul is telling these Christians, and Paul is in prison right now, so it seems kind of odd that he is talking about this, but he is committed to this and is trying to encourage them in their Christian walk. And he is encouraging them to be devoted in prayer. And then he adds, let's talk about the word prayer here. It's the most common word used to represent the inward attitude to turn to God. Most common word, proskuno, to turn to God, an inward attitude. In Philippians, it talks, and we quote it quite a bit, in Philippians chapter 4 here. Let me see if I can find it very quickly. Where Paul talks about, verse 6. Be anxious for nothing. Now, in verse 6 of Philippians 4, but in everything by prayer, there's our word, proskuno, and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Most preachers simply draw attention to this verse as an encouragement to be in prayer. It is much more than that. You have 4 different words for prayer, and they are like the tiers of a staircase going upwards. And if you don't touch on each of these stair steps, you are not going to have the peace of God that passes all understanding. Now, if we just stop and take a look at the first word there, proskuno, what is the first thing that often you and I do when there is a difficulty in life? When there is an uncertainty, when there is an unknown, when you have to make a decision, when your emotions are upside down, whatever it might be, the most common thing that you and I do is what? We turn inward or we turn outward to a trusted source instead of turning upward to God. That's the idea here that Paul is encouraging them to do. Devote yourselves to prayer. Develop the inward attitude to turn to God in spite of difficulties, to remain firm and stay in a fixed direction. And then he says, keeping alert. That means constantly watching. Devote yourselves to prayer, keeping alert in it. Keeping alert in prayer. Prayer will sharpen your spiritual senses to your environment and to your surrounding. It will give you discernment as to what is taking place. It can even give you discernment into the attitude and the actions of another person. This is the power of prayer. So when we think of prayer, it is more than 5 to 8 minutes on Sunday morning as a pastor leads in pastoral prayer. It is more than 15 or 20 minutes when the ladies get together or the people get together before the morning service. It is more than 10 or 15 minutes at the beginning or the close of your devotional time. We are to be constantly in prayer. The attitude to turn to God in prayer, and in so doing, we are constantly watching through prayer about my situation and how the Lord would want me to respond and react to what is going on. Then he says, praying at the same time for us as well. Here, stop at Thanksgiving, okay? With an attitude of thanksgiving. I think this is anticipatory Thanksgiving. Haven't you ever been in a season of prayer and you are petitioning God for something? And have you developed or tried to develop a perspective of giving thanks for the answers to prayer that God will send your way, even though you don't know what the answer might be? Well, Rick, that's kind of silly, isn't it? Thanking God for something you don't know what he's going to do. Beloved, that's faith. That's part of the Christian life. We can thank God for what he's going to do, even though you and I don't know what he's going to do, how he's going to do it, and when he's going to do it. That's faith. That's Hebrews that we've been studying for over a year that we've been together. So that's the idea in keeping alert and praying with thanksgiving, thanking God for what he will do, whether I know what it is or not. Thanking God for his past activity that demonstrates he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Thanking God for his attributes in the situation of his omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresent, compassion, love, tenderness, kindness, goodness. These are things of thanksgiving that we can anticipate for the Lord to do. Now, Paul switches to a personal request here. You don't find a lot of Paul's prayer with a expanded prayer list for himself. There are times where Paul has asked that an open door be given to him and that he might be able to continue the ministry, that God would heal him, but he accepted the grace that was given to him. So here we have in verse 3, praying at the same time for us as well. So as you are praying for one another, Paul says, remember to pray for me in the same way, but I'm going to ask you to pray specifically for one or two things. Number one, I want you to pray that God will open up to us a door for the Word. Open up a door for the Word. And I forgot to put the explanation there. I'm sorry. That next phrase there deals with verse 4. Paul has asked one time before that an effectual door of opportunity be opened to him so he could preach the gospel. Notice the purpose there in verse 3, so that we may speak forth the mystery of Christ. In other words, Jew and Gentile coming together and called the church, for which I have also been imprisoned. Paul's been imprisoned because of his proclamation of the gospel. That's his only charge that has been levied against him. And then he says that I may make it clear in the way I ought to speak. Now here's a literal Greek translation of that phrase. In wisdom, walk towards those outside the time, redeeming. In other words, as we live in this world, we need wisdom. We need skillful living. That's what the word wisdom means by definition. The Greek word is Sophia. You get your childhood name Sophie from this. But in wisdom, in skillful living, I can walk towards those outside. I can walk before others on the outside during the time that I'm living to redeem the situation with them and for them if they are willing. So in other words, Paul is saying to these Christians, I want you to be aware of the opportunities that God is going to grant you and walk in such a fashion that your words will complement your walk and that they will be unified in the message. And then he talks about our speech to be seasoned. Go back to verse 5. Conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. I think that last part is something we should pause and think about. Making the most of the opportunity. Every interaction that we have with people is an appointment, a divine appointment by God. It's not an interruption by people demanding our time. It may feel like that. It may seem like that. But from our Christian perspective, it is an opportunity that God has granted, so I will have speech that is seasoned properly, drawing the person to the person of Christ. The idea of the speech being seasoned with salt, verse 6. Salt is an additive to create thirst. And the gospel is the additive to create thirst to come to Jesus, the living water, that we might have our thirst once and for all satisfied and quenched, and avoid what Isaiah says about coming to empty cisterns. And so it says, let your speech, verse 6, always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. Now, verse 6, I believe, has a direct link to verse 2 about devoting ourselves to prayer. As we adapt this attitude of having the propensity to turn to God immediately in any given situation, I believe He will help season our speech to make it attractive, to create a thirst in the person of Christ as we speak about Christ and who He is and what He has come to do. like the woman at the well who wanted Christ to give her living water and said, "You have no bucket to draw from." And Jesus was able to take it one or two steps further and remind her that the water that he offers will be like a spring of water welling up on the inside of her. And so Paul is talking about two basic things in these verses: prayer and then communication. Communication. Next week, when we get together, we will finish off chapter 4, and we will simply be taking a look at some of the people that Paul ministered with and get a little bit of a background on them and some information that might be helpful, because you will see their names scattered throughout some of Paul's epistles. Thoughts or questions?
I just got a thought. I was thinking about you saying to thank God for answered prayer before it's answered. That might help to be able to surrender all the, aggravation and whatever you're thinking to try to do things yourself. I mean, make it easier to thank him, because you know that he's got your best interest. He knows what's going to go on before you do, and
That's
if
right.
we can thank him for it, it might help us to surrender it.
Yes, absolutely, Jeanette. That's a great observation. And that is one of the great spiritual struggles that every Christian has, isn't it? We come to the Lord, and we got our shopping list, we got our prayer list, and too often we neglect Thanksgiving. Yeah, I mean, the Christian has every reason to thank God for whatever that prayer request is, whether we know how he's going to answer it or not. We can do that because of his very nature on who he is. And as you pointed out so succinctly, Jeanette, he knows what's best for us because he wants the best for us. That's a great observation, Jeanette. Great observation.
Thank you.
You get 2 gold stars tonight. Anybody else? Well, Sunday we are going to finish off Hebrews chapter 12. And then we have Hebrews 13 probably take us the month of April to go through it. I don't think I want to go any faster through that. Now, my thoughts for after this class, unless I hear from somebody, is we could go Old Testament and do a study in Esther. I don't know whether the church has ever done a study in Esther or not, with its theological implications and stuff. Or we can continue on in the New Testament and take a look at 1 Thessalonians. I need input from you. If there is another topic, another area that you would like to branch out on, please send me an email as soon as you can. If it is outside the purview of what I've talked to you, there'll be more preparation for me to do, which I'm willing to do, but I want to make sure I set a table that you're willing to come and dine at. So that is your challenge, okay? Well, I want to thank you for tuning in and for your faithfulness. This is always an encouragement to me. Joni texted me this morning, and she was hooked up to fluids, And the whole procedure, by the time she got done with the infusion of the chemo, it was looking like a 3-hour process that was taking place. And I'm just hoping that it was just the initial setup for her and that she doesn't have to go through that every time. Now, I don't know whether she's going every day or once a week either. I'm not privy to that information. But let's continue to pray for her. Her sister is helping out for several days so Ben can get back to work. She is extremely thankful for the silent blessings that you gave to her on Sunday. Somehow she got wind of it, or somebody took it out to her, or whatever, and it just brought her to a whole mess of tears. But she was very, very thankful for the ladies' prayers and support and acts of love. So just to encourage you ladies in what you're doing. Well, if there's nothing else, I bid you good night and trust that